with this webinar series is really to explore this challenge, whether the people we serve live in a rural area, a suburban area, or an urban area. We know that people with disabilities, people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable, are at risk of social isolation, are at risk of being separated from the greater society and the greater culture. And with that in mind, loneliness abounds for folks that are oftentimes socially isolated. And I want to start with this as a core piece for a number of reasons. I think pre-pandemic, we knew that loneliness was on the rise, not just for people who are vulnerable, but actually for society. And I'm going to share with you some data, some things we're learning about loneliness and about isolation. Um, but more now that we find ourselves in a pandemic, where we are actually told to be stay away from people, to socially distance, to not engage. That's even further exacerbated this challenge and this problem. So let's go down this path as Tim indicated in the introduction. I'm going to put on some ideas and some concepts. I'm going to go through these slides. You'll have access to these slides. If you don't have them now, you will be able to get them. Tim will make sure that they're distributed. So let's really talk about this from a perspective of how what can we do? How can we, as affiliates of cerebral palsy, how can we intervene? Now, when you start at the beginning on this, we know that all people, whether they have disabilities or not, want to be active in community and want to participate, want to be productive. People want to work. They want to contribute, right? People want to be treated with dignity and respect, and all of these things are universal um, phenomena of human beings, right? We all want this, but we know that certain people are more at risk of not being able to achieve these things. Um, and we also know that when people don't have these things, bad things can happen, right? When people are separated from community, when they're separated from or have challenges in getting jobs or participating in community, um, that people begin to feel less confident. They start to become more depressed. They basically have more sick days. That social isolation and loneliness have actually been tied to premature morbidity. That literally people who are isolated or lonely die sooner than other populations. Now, I'll show you some data on this, but when we look at this societally or socially, we know that there's cohorts of people, groups of people who are at greater risk of isolation and loneliness. Obviously, we're talking about disabilities, and every one of us on this call today work for or work in a disability support system. But it's not just people with disabilities who are at risk of social isolation. Elders, I mean, this is a huge issue now as the baby boomers move into their senior years. Um, we're seeing advocacy groups like AARP really focusing on social isolation as couple of reasons. People's friends start to die. People maybe move to warmer climates and they're in a new community. People start to have chronic struggles as they age that make engaging and participation a little harder, and so consequently greater risk of loneliness. But we also know economics affect connection, and that people who are poor, economically challenged or deprived, are more at risk of being isolated. Single parents families or individuals who are raising a family by themselves, um, mental health conditions, ethnic minorities, sexual orientation differences, all of those things. Anyone who might feel different is at risk of isolation and loneliness. Now, one of the things that's important as we sort of launch this webinar series is to really understand what's similar and what's different between these two um, issues, right? Because they're cousins, but they're not synonymous, right? Social isolation is a state in which people lack a sense of belonging, right? They actually have minimal people in their life. So we think about rural communities, we know that, folks can really be dispersed in a larger geographic setting, right? And have actually less people available to them, right? So that social isolation can happen because of geography, right? So when you have less people in your life, that that's what we call social isolation. However, loneliness is a feeling that people have, and it can occur in presence or absence of isolation. And I give an example. I do a lot of traveling in the work that I do as a consultant, and when I feel like I'm a socially connected person, right? A big family, lots of friends, lived in Pittsburgh my whole life, kind of know just about everybody in my community. Yet when I travel, I find myself in a hotel, having to eat meals by myself. And I feel lonely, right? I feel like, I feel sad. I feel sad for myself. So even though I'm a socially connected person, I have these times when I can really be lonely. And I think that this sort of juxtaposition of isolation and loneliness are two phenomena that are really pretty powerful when you add them together, right? If somebody really is disconnected and now really feels lonely because of it, that's double indemnity right there. Now, social isolation is objective, right? You can identify it. And as we talk more in this webinar series, I hope that you're able to join in the sessions that Tim has planned, because one of the sessions we're actually going to talk about how we might map or gauge or measure connections and connectedness, right? There are sociograms and ways that you can actually begin to measure how connected people are. And we're going to actually do some of that in our upcoming webinars. Loneliness, however, is subjective. It's felt and it's articulated by the person. So someone could be in the midst of lots of people and just be feel so lonesome that they could die, right? So understanding that, let me share a little bit of data, what we know about loneliness and isolation, and the what they can do to a person. And again, this is generic. This looking at social isolation and loneliness right now, we're looking at it vis-a-vis its basic merits as a topic. So any one of us on this call, are affected by this. There's been lots of more recent research on loneliness and isolation, and in fact, a study done at Brigham Young University, a longitudinal study over a number of years, followed a lot of people. 308,000 people followed in this particular study, at least 7.5 years, some up to 15 years. And what they discovered was that those who had social relationships had a 50% greater likelihood of survival. 50%. Now this was face slapping, because it's comparable to the mortality data that we have related to smoking or physical inactivity or obesity. Things that were really perceived to be problems that could cause someone to get sick sooner or even die sooner, that relationships is just as prominent. And it's really caused health insurance companies to begin to look at social determinants of health and really putting things like relationship building right up there with some of those more classic things that we know about in terms of keeping a healthy lifestyle, quitting smoking, exercising more, getting a lot of sleep, eating well. Um, but it also has been measured now as a really huge problem in relationship to cost. And this study done at Stanford and Harvard, that was just earlier this year, right? Where they discovered that social isolation can cost upwards to $7 billion a year, mostly in additional Medicaid costs for longer hospital stays and not having somebody at home to when somebody is getting discharged from a hospital. So loneliness and isolation is incredibly costly to communities and to societies. Now, Julianne Holt Lunstead, uh, one of the most prolific researchers in this, in a paper that she had presented, I pulled this out because I thought it was really powerful. Simply living alone or in an isolated place may be just as harmful to your health as feeling lonely. So what Lundstedt is actually saying here is that loneliness and isolation, either one of them can be bad, but when you mix them together, they're incredibly lethal. Now, one of the fascinating things in the research that I've done and continue to do on isolation and loneliness is the biology behind loneliness. That literally there is a primal reaction that human beings have when they're rendered in an isolated way, going all the way back to our sort of tribal behaviors, hunters and gatherers, and early humanity. If someone was separated out from their tribe, what begins to happen is physiological reactions trigger in the human body. Respiration, inflammation, circulation, nervous system goes on edge. And all of those systems, all those systemic sort of triggers were basically done to help survival because what happens as beings if we're in an isolated situation, we're vulnerable, we're at huge risk. We are social animals, and our survival is really tied to each other. So these kinds of physiological things kicking in when somebody is isolated or lonely is a mechanism designed to keep us safe. However, in the long haul, if somebody's in an isolated or lonely situation, for months or years, and these phenomena, these physiological phenomena kick in, they can have incredibly debilitating consequences. And so, some of the things that begin to happen with this, is obviously depression, cocooning, separating out. And when you do that, when you're in an isolated or a separated state from other people, it diminishes serotonin and oxytocin, which are two really important enzymes for human connection. Um, and so we have this physiological phenomena that's associated as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because of all these things, health insurance agencies have really begun to want to get their hands around isolation and loneliness, and they want to begin to find interventions that will lessen isolation and loneliness for people, their claimants, because they know that if people if they're isolated less, or if they really feel less lonely, they're going to be healthier. They're actually going to be healthier, and there's going to be need for less investment in them, right? And so for Cigna and other major insurance companies, this is really kind of cost containment by looking at connectedness. So Cigna in 2018, this is just 2 years ago, guys, um, did a long focused study on loneliness, and they didn't do it with people with disabilities. They did it generically in community. And what they did was they used the UCLA Loneliness Scale. Now, this loneliness scale, I sent it up to Tim, and he's going to make it available to you if you haven't seen it yet. And when you get the scale, that the loneliness scale, there are 20 items on the loneliness scale. And this was initiated and developed in 1968 at the University of California in LA. And it's been utilized now since 1968 in many, many studies internationally. It uses a 4-point Likert scale, which have these four gradations: never, rarely, sometimes, often, right? And for each of those, there's a point available. So for never, there's 1 point. For rarely, 2 points. For sometimes, 3 points. For often, 4 points, right? And then there's a series of questions, 20 questions. And I've given you a couple here on this slide just to kind of look at it if you haven't seen the scale yet. So a question like this is asked: how often do you feel that you lack companionship? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, right? And whichever, gradation you choose, there's points associated with that. So with 20 items, with never getting 1 point, if you said never to every question, that would be a total of 20 points, right? If you said often for all 20, that would be 4 points each, or a total of 80. So the scale, the loneliness scale, is an objective. It tries to objectify this measurement of loneliness. Now, as this has been done over time in the United States, the score of 43 or higher indicates loneliness. Obviously, the higher you get up around 70, 75. That's a hugely lonely, score. The lower, then, the more connected, or at least the less lonely someone feels. So if you go back to this Cigna study, and by the way, if you're interested in really looking at this study in greater depth, you could just Google Cigna Loneliness Study 2018, and the whole study will come up, all the the reports on it. But here's just a couple things I pulled for you when the psychologists at Cigna did this study with 20,000 Americans from all over the country, all different ages, by the way. What they discovered was that nearly half of Americans reported sometimes or always feeling alone or left out, right? And that's huge. That's really a serious score. Um, Only half of Americans, 53%, have meaningful in-person interactions, right? I mean, this scale really, shined a light on loneliness in our country. Now, the interesting thing is that when Cigna did their study, they didn't include people with disabilities, right? They wanted to get a normative look at community, right? And no one has really done any kind of a, major look at loneliness and disability, right? Um, So part of the study that, part of the project that CP of New York State has received, um, we might want to do some of this. We might want to take a little more measured look at people's connection and their connectedness. Um, and so, with this, was trying to get our hands around loneliness and isolation. This takes me to a quote from the late great Robin Williams, who said, "I used to think that the worst thing in life was ending up alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is ending up with people who make you feel alone." Now, this is a pretty powerful quote because it really speaks to agencies like ours who support people, and DSPs who are oftentimes the only people, the only major people in someone's life because of their either their isolation or their disconnection, right? So when we think about loneliness and isolation and engagement, some of the more recent research has really begun to identify variables or barriers that have been associated with isolation or with disconnection. Um, Economic impact, for example, we know if somebody has less discretionary money, they're not going to engage as much. They just don't have the resources to engage. Right? Logistical challenges. I know this as a family member when Dad's Parkinson's began to become more overt, and we would try to keep him involved in the community, get him to church and get him places where he had always gone his entire life. The logistics of this were a nightmare. Like, where are we going to park? Is it accessible? What entrances we have to do? If we were going out to a restaurant, could we get it? I mean, logistics in disability are huge, huge hindrances. Increased medical appointments. We know that when folks have disabilities, they go to the doctor more often, and they go to the therapist, and they go to the clinic, and for every minute they're there, that's one less minute that they're engaging, right? Um, Social stigmas. Families reporting to us that they feel that people don't want them there, that they feel either embarrassed or other people seem to fear them, back away from them. Any of us that are on this call that have been out and about with someone with a significant disability, say we were just going anywhere, we get into an elevator, just watch everybody else in the elevator move away from you. This is pre-COVID, man. When I mean, it with COVID, we're backing away from everybody. But the long and the short of understanding isolation and loneliness is to recognize what are the antecedent issues that oftentimes are associated with this. So how do we address this, right? What do we do about isolation and loneliness, right? Um, and that's really the entire meat and potatoes of the webinar series that we're going to be doing. But we need to re-examine the roots of this problem, and we need to think about isolation. And often we think that the reason somebody has a problem is them, right? They're the reason. And unless we can mitigate that, that person won't be successful in connecting. And so a lot of the energy is micro in nature, micro. Now, next session, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this micro macro, but um, the notion here is that we can only do so much to fix someone or to change them, and in many cases we can't fix them at all. I remember my cousin Carrie and her speech impediment caused by cleft palate from her Down syndrome. Right? And when this is years and years ago. I mean, Carrie and I were born the same year. Carrie passed away a couple years back, but um, when when we reached out to agencies to help us, to help Carrie, my uncle and aunt, they said, well, one of her big problems, she can't speak very well. People don't understand her. That's why, she's struggling. So let's get her to speech therapy. So Carrie went to countless hours, thousands of hours of speech therapy, right? And at the end of all that time where she tried and tried to speak better and she couldn't. Um, she felt like a failure. All that money that was essentially wasted because Carrie's speech didn't really get better, right? Now, the interesting thing, if you see that as a micro problem, then you're going to invest in trying to fix that problem. But if you back up and begin to say, maybe this is a problem in how people listen, how other people around Carrie listen, because up on Condeluci Hill, we all understood everything Carrie said. There was no speech problem with us on the hill with Carrie, yet there was a speech problem. Why? Like, what was the difference? And the difference was that Carrie was a part of the tribe. I mean, she was one of us. And so we listened better to what Carrie said so that we could understand, what she wanted and how she could participate. Right? That's a macro change. That's us changing for Carrie, as opposed to expecting Carrie to change for society. Right? Now, this micro macro, again, next session, we're going to delve into it a little bit deeper. But change theory helps us sort of appreciate this. And just as it relates to social isolation and loneliness, I want to share with you that in a micro approach, right, we're looking clinically at the person and we're saying, okay, they have this problem, they have that problem. They flap, they're, whatever the problem might be. We spend a lot of time and attention doing that, right? But in the micro analysis, we can only go so far in terms of fixing the problem. Right? We can only do so much. So when we think about social isolation and loneliness, here are some micro interventions that are classic. They've been used and continue to be used, and some of them very efficaciously being used. Right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, cultural profiles. In fact, we're going to talk in our webinar series about a number of these methodologies on the micro side of the scale, right? However, these alone aren't going to create inclusion. They're not going to create successful engagement. They'll help. Some of these will help, but they're not going to do it all. We have to turn our attention as well as change agents to the macro, to the community side, thinking more about the culture, about the environment, right? Now there are two tracks on macro change. One of them. There are two ways you can change a culture, right? Or you can try to change how people think in a culture. One of them is by passing a law, right? And we passed the ADA in 1990, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act. And that was a macro change agenda. And those we advocates that were there for that battle, we argued that if only people could get in someplace, then they would find greater success. And so we passed the ADA saying, no, people have to be accessible. Public accommodations have to be made to make things accessible. So we passed the ADA in 1990, right? And yet people are still not engaged and really included, right? So passing a law alone is not going to also be a precursor to successful inclusion, right? So there's another track, a more informal track, and that's on building relationships. Because when you build a relationship, people begin to see the humanity of a person, right? So that's social capital. We're going to actually talk a little bit about social capital in our next session. We'll talk a little bit, talk a lot about social capital. But let me give you some macro interventions that have been shown and done um, to address um, the community, changing the culture, right? Um, Community mapping. We have an entire webinar session that we're going to be doing in January on community mapping and understanding what are the resources, what are the places and spaces in our communities where people gather. Um, Libraries, community centers, other kinds of more generic places, but also, more specific places that are in our communities. Gatekeepers, coffee connections, community benches. Some of these macro strategies we're going to have an entire session on as we move through our webinar series. Right? And so let me just share with you that the problem of loneliness and isolation is not just a problem in America or in the United States, it's a problem all over the world. And in my practice, I've had opportunities to do trainings and meet people and share ideas in the UK and in Scandinavia and in Australia and New Zealand and also, and of course, throughout Canada and the US. But the UK really gives an interesting example. In 2018, just 2 years ago, um, the Parliament in the UK promulgated a commission to study loneliness, not just for disability. Now, this is generic loneliness in the UK, seemed to be a huge problem in their society. Um, and after studying this issue, they decided to address it by actually establishing a minister to deal with loneliness. This is like a parliamentary level office reporting right to the prime minister about loneliness. And they had three major goals that they were launched with. One was to reduce stigma. What they discovered was that if people said they were lonely, that they were perceived in a devalued way. People made fun of them, or people didn't want to be around them. People thought they were losers, and so folks don't want to admit that they're struggling with loneliness. Um, they also wanted to put loneliness on the national platform in the UK, and then to improve the evidence and the data, right? Things like the loneliness scale, so ways of trying to measure and get our hands around this. They began to actually launch some actions, some strategies. Again, when we get into, we're going to get into a macro session in our fifth session in the webinar series that's really going to explore some of this. So Margaret Wheatley said, human conversation is the most ancient and easiest way to cultivate conditions for change, any level of change. That we have to talk. We have to talk with each other. We have to talk with other people. We have to be invited into the conversation. That's the only way that change happens, right? And it's not our differences that divide us, it's the judgments we hold about these differences, right? Difference is natural in community. The ADA actually says that. The ADA says disability is within the natural realm of the human experience, right? The disability is natural. It's our judgments about these differences. If we look at our politics, our current politics, right? And we look at, we just had our election where, we had, an isolationist sort of an agenda from one side and an inclusion agenda from another side, right? Two very different political ways of addressing things. And one of them was trying to get people to fear strangers or fear people who are different from you. The other was trying to basically create diversity and recognize that diversity strengthens a culture as opposed to limiting the culture, right? So This idea of social capital, which is our next topic for the webinar, which we're going to be doing in January, and Tim will be getting dates for this. And we want you to, if you can come back, if you can re-plug in, if you can tell other people to join us, that'd be great, because it's going to be a very robust conversation and interaction that we're going to do as it relates to relationships. But social capital will be the theme, and social capital has been a has been a term that sociologists have been looking at since it was initiated in the literature in 1916. That was the very first time that references were made to social capital, right? And social capital actually refers to the value we reap from our relationships. Not just that we reap, but the value we offer to others in our relationship, and how relationships really build pro-social behaviors of tolerance and respect and kindness, enhancing health and happiness. And next session, I'm going to get into some of the data on this and some of the examples. But the final point is that we know that social capital actually promotes longevity, that the more relationships people have, the longer they live. And now the relationships have to be relevant relationships. And we'll talk more about some of that in our next session. So if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risks of dying in half over the next year. So if you don't remember anything that we say in this webinar, focus in on this quote and go join something, because by joining something, you basically, create a safety net for yourself. By being by yourself or being less in the mix, you are at greater risk of dying. So there's some things in building community. Next session, this is just a teaser. Next session, we're going to look at these 4 elements of how to build social capital, how to build relationships. And by the way, this is generic, not just for people with disabilities, although certainly we can apply these strategies, and I'm going to talk about how we can do that. But for yourself, for your children, for other people who might be at risk of being isolated, these are the steps that get people to connection. And the final piece is the gatekeeper. We're going to look at the gatekeeper strategically. We're going to actually do an exercise next webinar on gatekeepers. We're going to do a little bit of measuring. So let's just fast forward to today. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we've had the highest incident count yesterday of infections in the United States than ever before. The highest number of deaths. So this is a serious, sobering phenomenon that we find ourselves in, right? And that, and here we are talking about social connections and building relationships, and the pandemic is saying, put a mask on and distance yourself, and stay up, don't gather. And so this is really a huge juxtaposition that basically works against trying to get people connected. It creates loneliness and isolation, as opposed to in the spirit of trying to keep us safe, right? So let me just share with you, however, that as we find ourselves in this pandemic, and the hope is that it's not going to, that we can see the light at the end of this tunnel. I mean, the tunnel is going to be still long and it's going to be dark, but we see a vaccine in sight. People are already getting inoculated, and so hopefully, as we move into the summer and into the spring or into the fall, we're going to be able to reconnect more with people. But in the meantime, what do we do? Right? So I'm going to just share with you some of the things that I gathered in a little kind of a softer research survey I did with 80 agencies from around the United States and Canada. I did this in April, and I basically, asked these agencies, um, what are they doing? How are they trying to keep people engaged? And so here's a laundry list of things. You already know some of this, right? Zoom, FaceTime, Skype. I mean, these are things. I mean, we're on Zoom right now, right? So these kinds of things are now becoming almost a natural part of our culture. But applications that get people engaged in virtual tours that that where people can do things, online classes, yard games, drive by activities. Just last evening, we took our grandkids we did a drive by thing through this park that was lit up for the holidays, right? So we were in our car, and we didn't have to get on and engage with anybody. We drove through, and we sort of saw the lights and had fun doing that. So cooperative games, word games, and other games that people can play. Joining meetup groups. Meetup groups are using Zoom and Skype and FaceTime so much more. Working on joint projects. So there are things we can do in the meantime. The other thing we can do in the meantime is really build our own capacity. And that's really what this webinar series is designed to do. Because when we get out beyond this tunnel and get back into the light, we want to get people engaged actually, physically. We don't want to rely on Zoom to do this anymore. We want to get people back in the mix. And so the webinar series, as part of the project that Tim talked about, is going to really focus attention on that. And so there must be a beginning to any great matter, but continuing until the end, until it be thoroughly finished, yields the true glory. That's a great quote from Sir Francis Drake, but it really does apply to our movement. I started off talking about my own path, right? With my cousin, growing up with my cousin, going, graduating from college and getting my first job in an institution, seeing the horrors of institutionalization, led me to become, an advocate for community. And closing down institutions became our battle cry. And and those were the beginnings of our great matter, right? Because people with disabilities have been left behind from time immemorial. And we know historically separated, segregated, institutionalized, left behind, attics, basements. Um, and so our journey as advocates starts with, the liberation of those kinds of things. But continuing until the end, until it be thoroughly finished, that's where the true glory is here. And we've just begun to scratch the surface, right? Because in spite of all of our deinstitutionalization programs that we did, that were part of my work at UCP in the early 70s with my colleagues all around the country, closing down institutions, getting people into the community, hasn't really, gotten people really engaged and truly included in those communities, right? We've got a huge step in front of us. And that really, I think, is the macro step. And so in our webinar series, we're going to examine these in terms of building our own capacity for making change happen. So let me just finish my organized remarks and turn into some Q&A and some dialogue as best as we can with Zoom by finishing up with this little parable called An Aztec Story. Right? I found this little parable in a book by Margaret Wheatley. The book is called Conversations Can Change the World. Margaret Wheatley, just a wonderful thinker about change, right? And macroscopic change. And so here's how this little parable goes. It's short and to the point. A long time ago, there was a great fire in the forest that covered our earth. People and animals started to run, trying to escape from this fire. Our brother Al Takalo, he was running away also when he noticed a small bird hurrying back and forth between the nearest river and the fire. He headed toward this small bird. He noticed that it was our brother, the Quetzal bird, running to the river, picking up small drops of water in his beak, and then returning to the fire with that tiny bit of water, putting it on the flame. And the owl approached the Quetzal bird. The owl said, "Brother, what are you doing? Are you crazy? You're not going to put the fire out with just a little drop of water. You got to run for your life. You got to take care of yourself. You're not going to put the fire out." The Quetzal bird stopped for a moment. He looked at the owl and he answered, "I'm doing the best I can with what I have to save a place that I love." It's remembered by our grandparents that a long time ago, the forests that covered our earth were saved from a great fire by a small little Quetzal bird and an owl and many other animals and people that got together to put out the flame. This is such a beautiful parable of synergy. Right? This is a parable of, of modeling. It's a parable of social influence, and that is when one person does something that is positive, other people see that, and they get influenced by it. And then if they do something positive, another good thing happens, and a third good thing happens, and then soon all the boats begin to go up. So Gandhi was right with this quote, and I know you know this quote, right? We must become the change we hope to create. That literally, if we want to create an inclusive community, a welcoming society, then it really starts with us. It starts with our own behavior, what we teach our children, and what we model, and what we practice in our own lives. And so, a lot of what we're going to do as we go down this webinar series in January and February is really not only build capacity um, in terms of understanding, not just micro things. There are some micro things we're going to talk about and we're going to really look at, but macro influence. How do we change attitudes and perceptions in our greater culture and society? And so what this last slide I put up is really a contact information for me. And I put it up there for a couple of reasons. One is um, if we're going to do a Q&A right now, but if we don't get to your question, or if you want to muse a bit, or maybe you digest some of this, or you take a look at the loneliness scale, or the article I sent, an article, a white paper that Tim will make sure you have, it might spur a question or a thought that you have, and I want you to be able to get in touch with me. This is my email, this is my phone number, and my website on this listing. And on my website, I have a number of videos about social isolation, about building social capital. I have a TED talk that I did in 2014 in conjunction with the publication of a book I wrote. I wrote 8 books. I had a book come out in 2014 called Social Capital: The Key to Macro Change. And so if you're interested in getting a hold of these things, I know Tim was talking about wanting to build some resources through the project. And so we'll have some of the books available in a library that the state office will have. But if you're personally interested, you can track some of these. I have a lot of chapters from some of these books that you can upload from my website. You can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. I try to blog every week, something really short about community and community building, because I think the more we have conversations, the more we think about how we change our culture, the more we'll act on it, and the more we act on it, I think the more we'll see happen. And so, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing this the slideshow, and then pitch it back to Tim. He can go maybe through some of the questions if some questions unfolded, and if not, maybe some live questions that we can take while people the people might have on the topic. I think we have about 20, 22 minutes or so. So we've got some ample time to talk about loneliness, isolation, and community building. Tim?
Thanks, Al. That's outstanding. I mean, again, in order for this dialogue to kind of continue within our grant group, and then even some of you folks that are part of this session today that are not typically participating in our grant group, sometimes it is important to get sort of that educational academic base, so you build that understanding first, and then you can take some of those skills and strategies and implement them at the various affiliate locations where you might be at that work best for your organization and your agency. And I think that's really what the goal is of this series that Al continuously alluded to, that we are I'll be sending out those invites, if not this week, next week, and just kind of the dates that we picked. There's going to be 7 total sessions, and that'll get sent out to folks that participated today, and then also just obviously the general grant group. The materials that you will be receiving, again, is the PowerPoint, the article that Al had talked about, and also the UCLA scale too, so folks can get a look at that and see how you might want to adopt it and use it. And then I did record this session as well, so we are going to make that recording link available for everyone too. So I just wanted everyone to know that, if you have someone else in your agency that you think would have really benefited from today's presentation and couldn't make it, or you want to re-reference it after it's over with, we'll have these things available for each one of the sessions. So without going any further into that information, is there anyone, we don't have anything in the chat, just a couple people that told me they had to leave at certain points, but any folks here that would like to ask Al some questions or even comment on certain things and keep the dialogue going for a little bit.
And while people are thinking about that, Tim, one of the things that we've talked about related to the project is my being available for some coaching or some individual affiliate conversations. And so if you were maybe jazzed, or you become jazzed by some of these things that we go over, and want to dig a little deeper, want to look a little bit more, want to talk about how your affiliate can begin to utilize some of these macro strategies, we are going to have some coaching time available as part of the project. So kind of keep that in mind. Also, again, as I said during the session, that if after you digest some of this and you want to pose a question, please feel free to drop me an email or call, and we could chat a bit. I'll try to be as helpful as I can. I'm not going to have all the answers, obviously, but share with you experiences anyway that we've had, or that others that I know about around the world, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK, in Scandinavia, Sweden, specifically Ireland, and things that those cultures have done or are trying to do in terms of building more connections for people.
And I can get you in touch with Al as well. So if you want to reach out to me directly, we'll make sure that works out. If you want to reach out to him, whatever works. So, okay, let's turn it over to the group.
Al, just a reflection and maybe a conversation starter. Like you, I kind of started out pretty early. I grew up with a brother with autism. And so growing up with him in the 60s, I don't mean to date myself, you'd go places and it would be like, what's he doing out of his cage?
Right.
I really think that the world has changed dramatically. Now, if anything, he's, at 59, he's more stigmatized now than he was then. He was a cute little kid.
Yeah.
And I think people are more open to the idea. And I think the presence in the community of a lot of our organizations has really helped pave the way. And I see a lot of the issues with dealing with isolation have to do with the work on the ground and connecting the dots.
Yes.
And people sort of want to do the right thing. We're not in a point where it's like it was, like, my parents and later me were involved in creating community homes, and people would, we got all the not in my neighborhood. And, my sense is this, what works is, you start by asserting the equality and the rights that are under the law, that people never get it unless you do that. So you have to start with that. But the positive of the experience is people do come around. What happens is you move into a neighborhood and then people turn around and say, well, we were concerned about it, but they're like almost apologizing 5 years later. But what I see is, it's still this balance between macro and micro in terms of connecting people. And just another observation is in terms of the success of the people we support, just a few observations. There is a lot in the micro, in the sense that, certain individuals who come from family structures where they have this unconditional approval, they go into the community. It doesn't matter how impaired they are. They go into the community with a certain amount of social confidence, and a little help, learning a conversation, being introduced to people. They expect to be accepted on some level. And the people who don't have those experiences, and I work with a lot of post-institution people, they're very reticent. They're expecting to be rejected, and they have much more self-esteem issues. So I'm just making the argument. So it's like a 2-point thing, but I think, where I'm totally with you is when you talk about the problem is fixing our people. Well, we might help them, but fixing them is not what we're supposed to be doing, because that doesn't really work. When I say helping, I'm saying helping them find those points of self-esteem that become the basis of them making entrees and seeing their own value. To have a conversation with somebody, you have to imagine that you have some kind of common ground with them, and you have to have some basis of self-esteem. So I just want to throw that as a conversation starter. Again, my part of this is I'm much more focused now on, in this point of my career, in trying to develop real strategies that are effective in terms of connecting the dots.
Right.
So let me stop.
Yeah, Dan, thank you so much, man. We're two old warriors that have been at this for a lot of years, and you made multiple points, all really, really powerful. The connecting of the dots, just to kind of pick up on that, is really part of what we're going to be examining in some of these upcoming webinars. Today was really kind of an introduction, was really designed to sort of, in some ways try to fire people up and really say, we've come a long way, but man, we still have so much further to go, not just in terms of supporting people with disabilities, but as a society in general, that we, brothers and sisters that in our communities without disabilities are hugely lonely and feel disconnected. So it's a wake-up call, I think. Now, obviously, our population, thinking about your brother or my cousin, and the world that they grew up in, and how people treated them, it's a different world today. But in some ways, it's not. In some ways, people in society think, well, those disabled people have their own places. They got a great agency, CP in New York State. I give them money every year. They're fantastic. They take care of those kids like nobody's business, and that's the mentality. And I'm not trying to be pejorative, and I'm certainly not trying, in any way to put down the good hard work that organizations like CP of New York State or CLASS or any other of the fine organizations around our country. But the notion that community in some ways sees us as the answer and don't really necessarily see that they have a role here is a really pretty powerful, challenge because that abdication of responsibility that people defer to agencies or to systems keep people with disabilities adjunct to the culture as opposed to within the bosom of the culture. The other point that you raised, Dan, excellent point that I just did some research on with a university here in Pittsburgh called Chatham University, and we CLASS, the organization I work for, and Chatham kind of joined hands, and we looked at 50 families who had children. 25 had children with disabilities. The other 25 had similar demographic children of similar demographic levels, but they didn't have disability labels, right? And so we measured their engagement by using an instrument that was developed at Harvard called the Social Capital Benchmarking Survey. Next webinar, I'm going to share that as a tool with the folks that plug in. But we measured how engaged are these 50 families in their communities. Where do they go? Who do they go with? When do they go? And we discovered, as you might guess, that the families who had children with disabilities engaged far less in the community than the families who had children without disabilities. And all the reasons I mentioned in the webinar we just did, economics, logistics, people feeling welcomed, those were some of the reasons that we discovered. But the issue that you raised that ties into that research is that when we think about engagement and connecting the dots, your brother or my cousin joining a club or a group or an association in our greater communities, and people's readiness, people's willingness to let them in, and B, their appropriateness. When I say appropriate, I mean their understanding of the expectations that the group holds. That's learned behavior, right? I mean, we don't, as we're growing up, we don't take any class in how to engage with people, right? As kids, we observe our moms and dads, and then maybe our big brothers and big sisters and how they engage. We observe other kids engaging. And then from those observations, we begin to say, okay, if I behave this way, I'm going to be more successful when I join a club or when I and without that observation of community engagement, then people don't know what to do, what to say, icebreakers, small talk, all that stuff that's a part of the initial stages of building relationships. And so if the families, the 25 families who had kids with disabilities, if they engage less, that's less observation that their children have of them engaging. And if they just sit at home and watch Netflix and make popcorn and decide not to get onto the mix because they can't afford it, or because it's a pain in the butt, or because people aren't nice to them when they're there, then their children aren't going to have a good baseline of what do I do in a social situation, right? Now, obviously, there's cognitive overlays, people's ability intellectually to understand some of those kinds of things, and we've got to factor those in. but there's no question that I believe the real challenge is macro. Now there is micro work we have to do, and you're absolutely correct in acknowledging that. And some of the things we're going to talk about, some of the micro things, some of the recommendations I'm going to make are pretty easy to do. They're pretty. I mean, affiliates can take some of that information in and say, okay, yeah, we could try that. We could do this. We could do that. But at the end of the day, it's crossing that bridge to that community group and then really having some stickiness, right? The last point I'm going to say to your comments, and they were really rich and so lucid, Dan, is that there are two variables that I think are critical for engagement. And not, this isn't what I think, this is what the literature actually says. One of them is similarity, right? A reason to connect, right? So there has to be some element of similarity. But the second reason is regularity. I got to be there again and again and again. And if people only go to things like a moment in time, like here's an example. We discover that my cousin Carrie loves photography, right? And so we want to use photography as a bridge for her. So what if we choose to take Carrie to I don't know, a photo essay that some photographer is having, and we go to this photo essay and we go around and we look at the various photos and Carrie's there, and I mean that's a nice day. But after we leave the photo essay, it's done, right? There's no regularity built into that. So when we think about getting people engaged in community, the target has to have regularity built into it. So so that the person can go again and again and again. And it's a process. It's not like when somebody walks in the door the first time they go to the meeting, everybody's going to embrace them. That's probably not going to happen. It didn't happen to you, me, or you when we first joined something. But if we persevere, if we go again and again and again, sooner or later, we begin to, our presence just becomes more natural to people. People see our humanity a bit more. So I think these are some of the dots that we're gonna talk about trying to connect. Excellent points all, Dan. We're about 5 minutes out. Tim, are there any other questions that came in chat?
Nothing came in the chat right now. I think.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I can weigh in. Kind of piggybacking off of both your points, and I feel like a lot of us probably have our origin stories of why we do what we do. Mine kind of plays into this. My big brother, who has cerebral palsy, kind of brought me into this world. And a story actually today. I don't know, most of New York had a ridiculous snowstorm, and where my big brother lives, it had about 40 inches of snow. And he had work this morning, and the ride that was supposed to bring him, the car couldn't make it to him because of the snow. Right. So what he decided to do was take his broom and push the snow out of the way and walk the 2 miles to his work, cerebral palsy and all. And I say that story because part of it is kind of what we touched on, where not necessarily helping them, but empowering them to know that, they can do what they put their minds to. So I think that's, a good piece of it, and a big piece of it is empowering them to believe and know their capabilities. But kind of throughout these talks, I guess at the initial part of this rural outreach grant, my mind was like transportation. How do we get people from there to the center of community to be engaged? And my mind's kind of flipping now to more of the macro sense. Well, is it really that these individuals with disabilities have to go somewhere to go find where they're accepted? Or do we really have to reach out to those rural areas and kind of make sure that there's pockets of acceptance and understanding everywhere. So that's kind of where, as I'm digesting this, the 2 points, making sure that they have the tools to feel empowered themselves, and then and then kind of creating a full community of acceptance and understanding, rather than shipping them where it is.
Right. Dave, both are such powerful and critical points. And in thinking about this over this series that we're going to be doing, we're going to take nuggets of that and try to weave it into a tapestry that will give us more intervention ideas. How do you get a community to open up? How do you soften the infrastructure of that culture? Our third session that we have is going to, or our fourth session is understanding the social infrastructure of community, and just kind of getting our hands and our heads around some of those things, begin to become the dots that Dan was talking about, that as we start to tie them together, it gives us a more holistic, I think, way of thinking. And so there's lots more for us to really think about and explore. I'll be anxious to have you have your reactions to the paper that Tim talked about, this loneliness isolation paper that goes along with today's webinar. And I think also, Tim, did I not send up that study that we did in 2016 in Canada and the US? It's called Someplace to Live.
Yes, I do that. I see that actually right now on my other screen, so I can send that one too.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that would also be get to more of what David's points were in his comments.
Perfect.
Good. And anything else? Anybody else want to weigh in? Dan, David, thank you so much. And anybody else? Any other question, query, confusion, aha moment, or whatever that might have happened? Some of the content. And it doesn't have to be. I mean, we're not trying to, bait people. I just want you, if you have a question, even later, just throw it out to me. Throw it out to me, and I'll be happy to respond. I know that we're at 4 o'clock. We want to be mindful of people's busy time schedules, and so we're closing in on 4. I'm happy to remain if we want, or if not, I'll be excited about plugging into our next session. Tim's going to get us the dates. We're focusing in on some dates that we think will be ones that will be good for the majority of people.
Definitely. I'm sure there's a few people out that maybe have not gotten to their vehicles yet, or are going out for the second round of snow removal today. So we'll give people a chance to do that before it gets dark. But thanks a ton. I mean, this really kicks us off and gets us headed in a direction of good dialogue, and I think, intellectual ways of looking at things, and then again putting them into plans, into action plans ultimately, and that sort of thing. So yes, just as a review, there'll be 2 articles: the UCLA scale, the PowerPoint, and I'll send out the recorded link, as well as schedule those upcoming Zooms, and we will market those from the CP State office as well.
Yeah, I'd like you to take the loneliness scale if you can. It'll take you a couple minutes. You can self-score it. At the very bottom of the form is a scoring key. but leave the key, take the test first before you actually look at the scoring key, and then see where you fall. Remember, 43 is the tipping point on that UCLA scale. So take a look. Try to be as you're taking it by yourself. You don't have to share it with anybody. Just see what kind of score it yields. Also, maybe think about, can we use it with some of the people we're supporting to get our hands around, how they feel about their lives at this point. Okay.
All right, everyone. Well, we will sign off. Al, thanks again. We look forward to session number 2.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it very much. Looking forward to our next session, and hopefully at the end of this trail, seeing you guys.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to it.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
See you now. Thanks, Tim.
Yep.